Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation for an agriculture economics class. My name is Tyler Betcher, and later on we'll hear from Cole Blakey. Throughout this presentation, we're going to cover the background and article summary, implications for agriculture and Canadian farmers, and lastly, the underlying economics. This will be wrapped up at the end with a conclusion. The article we chose to do a review on is by James Nolan and Steve Peterson, titled Grain Handling and Transportation Policy in Canada, Implications for the United States. I'm now going to go over a brief overview of the article and explain some of the main points that it covers. To start with, the article goes over a brief background of the grain handling industry in Canada, and a major shakeup of that occurred in 2012 when the Canadian Wheat Board was deregulated. Previously, all wheat and barley in Canada had to be sold and marketed through the CWB, and so this deregulation caused a lot of side effects that Cole's going to go into a little bit later on. Next, some of the early policies. Initially, when the railways were built, some of the main issues were to settle the West and provide them with easy grain movement when they began farming. That policy continued to help farmers out by introducing the crow rate and giving them favorable shipping rates that way. Later on, more recently, the MRE, or Maximum Revenue Entitlement, was introduced. This was based largely on the review conducted by Etsy in 96-97. This was embraced by farmers initially, and it still is, because it limits the amount of revenue that a railway can make and has the effect of lowering the prices that they charge. We'll get more into the economics of this later on. Next, so the railways figured out that this MRE wasn't exactly the best for them. They realized that the prices they charge were quite limited based on the amount of money they could make. The farmers didn't want this removed, as I mentioned, because it did increase those rates, and it would see them increase to rates similar to the US, which does have much higher rates for shipping grain than Canada does. The article goes on to explain some of the extended interswitching policy that is being introduced and has been in place for a while now. What interswitching does is it allows one rail company to run on the other company's tracks for a certain distance. So previously this had been 4 miles for a number of years early on in the 1900s. This got up to 30 kilometers, which stood for many, many years, and now it recently got expanded to 160 kilometers. So what this does is it creates more competition by allowing grain elevators and grain companies to have two different options of who to ship their grain to port with. So with the new expansion to 160 kilometers, 70% of all elevators in the prairies have access to the two rail companies. One US company would also benefit from this because they have access in some of the southern parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta. The United States government themselves is considering introducing a similar policy, as they do have a bit of the same issue there. The last point I'm going to cover here in this overview is logistics that were drawn with the CWB. So the main thing the CWB did was coordinate the movement of grain from a country elevator into a port location. And so without it, we're seeing delayed shipments and slower delivery from the farmers, as well as higher basis levels. So this is going to be talked about a little bit more, but just kind of a brief overview of what it all is.
Hi, my name's Cole Blakey, and I'll be talking about the implications for agriculture in the grain handling and transportation industry and some of the policy changes that are taking place. So the biggest change, one of the biggest changes in the industry is the vote out of the CWB in 2012. So basically gave the marketing power to the grain companies, which at first seemed like a good idea. making the grain market more competitive. In theory, should mean an increase in prices for the farmers. However, as we read in this article, that is not the case, and the grain companies use this newfound marketing power to increase their own revenue rather than help the farmer move his grain and get the best price possible. Basically what was happening, and an example of this is in the article about grain companies giving a low bid to farmers but receiving a high bid at port when they're about to ship. So another issue in the rail transportation is whether interswitching is a good idea or not. For those of you that don't know what interswitching is, it's basically when one rail carrier or one rail company picks up a load of grain, but instead of taking that grain to the destination, it hands it off to another carrier, and in turn that carrier takes it. And so basically the intermingling of cars to trying to get greater efficiency in moving grain and transporting grain so that they can increase the capacity, the transportation capacity. So whether this is a good idea or not, it depends totally on who you ask. So if you ask the farmer or the grain company, they'll say it's a great idea because they're able to move more product, have a higher capacity. The farmers can sell more grain buyers can move more grain. But if you ask the grain transportation or the railway, it's not such a good idea to them because it means less revenue, less profit for them ultimately, because they aren't the sole carrier anymore. There is another carrier in there. And another issue is grain backlog. So without the CWB, in years where there's a bumper crop, an excess amount of grain, the rail capacity they cannot keep up to the amount of grain needing to be moved. So grain companies and farmers are forced to store grain for extended periods of time and not able to sell it or move it. So this is there's an example of this in the States. In 2013, 2014, they had a bumper crop and couldn't move it due to the competition in the market, and the capacity was too small. So the transportation capacity was too small. So basically, the idea is with the interswitching is that they can increase capacity, increase efficiency of moving grain, and ultimately get the farmer's grain shipped as quickly as possible and at a good price.
Okay, so we're now going to get into some of the underlying economics of this article and kind of explain what they mean and how the article goes about portraying them. So there's two main policies that are discussed here, the MRE and interswitching. So both were created by the government to institute lower shipping rates for grain in Canada, but both go about doing that in very different ways with different implications for different players. So to start with, the MRE. The basic legislation of the MRE states that a rail must move a set amount of grain per year and can only have a certain amount of revenue in that year. This is calculated on a year-by-year basis, and it's based on a few different factors, including revenue in the base year, number of tons moved in the base year, the average length of haul, and the number of tons moved in the current year. As well, there's a composite price index that is determined by the CTA, which is also included. If a railway is to exceed this cap, they'd be charged the amount that they're over plus 15%. So this gives railways incentive to cut costs, and these costs that they save aren't necessarily passed back to the shippers and the farmers. Lots of instances they're just kept by the railway for their own profits. So in 2015, the MRE was about $600 million, just to give you a bit of an understanding on that. It was found that in 2013 and 14, when there was the record crop year and lots of rain on the prairies, the railways got backed up quite significantly, and they charged much higher prices rather than hauling more grain. They did this to save their costs and remain under the revenue cap. They were able to do this because demand was so inelastic because there was just simply so much grain on the prairies at that time. It was estimated that farmers lost $2 to $3 billion just because of this instance. The government saw what was happening, and they decided to intervene. On March of 2014, they introduced the Fair Grain Act. So this required the railways to move 500,000 tons a week, or else they were fined a certain amount of money. So that's kind of an overview of the MRE and what it all did. The MRE is still in place, although as I mentioned before, the railways are trying to get rid of it now. The other policy that is currently in place and can be debated is interswitching. So I gave a brief overview of what interswitching was, and Cole did as well earlier on. So as I mentioned, it was extended to 160 kilometers in 2014. This increased competition, which was thought to decrease the prices. Without interswitching, there is in effect a dual monopoly, where each railway would have a monopoly over the set of tracks that they own. So with the extended interswitching to 160 kilometers, this created an oligopoly in many of the markets. So as I mentioned, this gave many elevators the access to the two different rail companies. So a study in the US found that increases in interswitching led to 20% lower rates, which equates to about $6 a ton with two or more railways. The pricing in an oligopoly is very much different than what a monopoly would see. So this is kind of the main reason why interswitching was introduced. In an oligopoly, there is competition, and pricing is based on the Cournot theory, or quantity. So the rail company will adjust its price based on quantity available. Also, into the price is the hoteling theory, where a higher price will be charged for a farther distance traveled. So that's kind of an overview of what interswitching is. It's been seen that there's been some great results with lower rates, and railways have become more competitive with each other, and this lowers the cost for farmers, and could be argued that farmers will benefit more this way just because they see the lower costs up front and they're not being cycled back through different channels and benefited more by the railway, which may be the instance with the MRE. So those are kind of the underlying economics that the article goes through. So on to the conclusion now, and this paper largely focuses on grain transportation in Canada, and it's investigated to find out which policy best suits all the parties involved. So over the years, there have been a number of changes to the policy, including having regulation and deregulating policies in an effort to make sure that the farmers are able to grow their crops and sustain profits themselves, and the railways are still able to remain competitive and be profitable as well. So as we went through in the paper, there have been many policies over time, but there's kind of two main policies that have been in effect here for the past couple of years that the paper largely focuses on, those being the MRE and interswitching policy. So with the MRE, farmers did see the losses with the demise of the CWB and the logistics that went along with it. They saw the fewer trains at elevators and lots of backlog in the winter of 2014. With interswitching, it's a relatively new policy. Over the few years that it has been in place, we have seen increased competition and lower prices to farmers. So overall, both the policies in place now have allowed the farmers to take more of a share of the savings that the policies have created, and as well the railways have been able to figure out ways to lower their costs in an effort to remain competitive, and still be able to ship grain, as well as the other materials that they ship in a day-to-day situation. So thank you very much for listening, and that'll wrap things up.